So we're starting with, we went to Unit 6, Lesson 13, and we're in Designated ELD because we're planning a Designated ELD lesson. So I'm using that template that we modified to include a language objective. So I know as a teacher that the first thing listed on this lesson plan is the standards. But I know if I scroll all the way to the bottom, it has both the ELD standards listed for me and the California, the Common Core standards listed. So I don't want to take the time to list those on a lesson plan when they're available in my lesson plan. So I'm just going to write as listed there. And again, I'm just doing this, just jotting it down, and then I'll go back and retype it so that we have it more formally. Then I really want to think about the objectives. So the objective there traditionally is the content objective. So what content am I using for my kids to get language today? So my content objective, if I scroll down and look at the standards, it's really reading literacy, doing some writing, some speaking and listening with regard to literature that I'm reading. So it's that RL. So I'm going to say that my content objective is reading literature, right? That's really my objective, is I'm going to read literature to do something with language. Now, if this were an ELA lesson, I would go into a lot of detail about what's my content objective there, because I want to find main idea, or I want to use description for the character. And I'm going to dig into those ELA standards. But this is not an ELA lesson. This is an ELD lesson. So basically, I just have to have enough of a content objective to give my kids something meaningful to talk about, okay? So I'm just going to say reading literature, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I just know that that's what I'm using. What's critical here is my language objective. So you can see that I've broken down what that means. So what are kids going to do? Are they going to deconstruct language? Are they going to expand language? Are they going to focus on the function, like compare and contrast? Are they going to look at structure? Are they going to look at syntax? Are they going to look at morphology, the pieces of vocabulary? Or are they going to focus on register, the difference between common language and more academic or formal language? Well, I see in my lesson plan that they're going to use prepositional phrases, and that they're going to use those prepositional phrases to ask and answer questions. And I'm kind of excited about that because it's also something that they're going to be measured on in the LPAC. So it's asking them to go into more depth, not to make something longer, but to make something better in speaking or in writing. So my language objective, I think, is going to be focusing on the syntax, the language of using prepositional phrases. So I'm going to say that my language objective, and I'm taking this right out of the student objectives there, is to use prepositional phrases to answer questions about a story. And they've done that for me. They've told me that objective. But what I want to remember as a teacher, the reason I'm rewriting it, is I want to remember what my purpose is. And so if you look there, it says to answer where and when questions. So I want to add that to my written lesson plan, that they're really focusing on where and when. And why are they focusing on where and when? I want to think like a linguist for a minute. What do prepositional phrases tell us? Where and when, right? You know, in the box, at the store, while I was doing this. So that just reminds me of what this would sound like. And again, the content is going to be them reading so that we can answer questions. So my input and modeling, what do my kids need to do in order to answer questions about a text? Yeah, they've got to either hear the story or read the story. So depending on their level, they're either going to read the story or I'm going to read it to them. And I believe that we're going to be working with threes, correct? Okay, my favorite animal in the ELD animal kingdom is the three. So I'm looking at expanding, which is number 2. So as I'm planning, I'm thinking about who do I have in this group? Do I have 1s and 2s? Do I have 3s? Do I have 3s who've been 3s for a long time? Do I have 4s who are almost a 5? So I'm going to look at that expanding. And so it says here I'm going to read with students on the table and underline phrases in the barrel in the cellar. So my input with the kids is going to be to review the story. So I'm just going to make that note to myself. And you'll notice I'm not typing long lesson plans because these are notes for me. So my lesson plan as an ELD teacher is something that I can read. My administrator is probably checking it to make sure I did it, but it's really so that I can understand what I'm going to do. So I'm going to review the story, and then I'm also going to use the table to remind students. And I think with 3s, it's going to be reminding them of how prepositions work. And I'm going to model for them, and I'm just going to make this note, model, so that I know I need to model this, how prepositional phrases answer where and when. Okay, so I'm going to review where and when, and how prepositional phrases answer that. And I was just talking with Steve and Julie this morning. A lot of times teachers will use something familiar to teach a new concept, like where and when with prepositional phrases. Like, think about walking to school today. How do you describe? Well, in the car, or getting to school today, in the car, at the gate, something of that nature. I always, with about 3rd grade and above, always want to use content we've already covered. So using a familiar story, or as we read the story, going back into the story, because I always want to keep our content academic. So I didn't really use things that were, like how to make a peanut butter sandwich to know the steps of something. I used a math problem to show the steps of something, just because I feel like it keeps it academic, and it kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone, giving them more content. So I'm going to use that where and when by going back into the story with them. My student engagement, they're going to need the text in front of them. And then I'm going to ask them to talk to a partner. And the reason I'm going to ask them, have them talk to a partner, and my kids were over talking to a partner because we did it all the time, but it's just a really quick, familiar way to get kids to talk. If I know that this is kind of a needier group, I may ask them also to use whiteboards here, because I want to see tangibly whether they get it, because I don't want to move too quickly with them. When I'm in a classroom, like I will be for this lesson, where I don't know the kids, I always use whiteboards, because I need that assessment for me, because they're not my own kids, so I don't quite know where they are. I even do that with high school kids, and you can imagine how they love it. They do not. And part of the reason they don't love it is because it's so engaged, and they've kind of learned to be disengaged. So whiteboards are just really helpful in re-engaging them. So my structured practice, these are 3s, and I don't think they're going to need a lot of structured practice here. I think it's going to be more reminding them of how this works. But if I see from that whiteboard work that they don't get it, then I'm going to provide specific examples from the text. And I'm not going to do that here, because that really is going to take me some time. I'm going to need to go into the story and actually say, where was the fox? I'm not familiar with the story, so I need to pre-read that story and be ready with a couple of examples of where and when answers within the text. So we won't take the time to do that today, just in the interest of time. But as a teacher, I would need to pre-read that story, obviously. My student engagement there, if they need it, would be whiteboards, again, or partner work. And now we get to the really nuts and bolts here. On our sheet in the back, it's called guided practice. But I would refer to this as your interaction, because you've already modeled for them, you've done your structured practice. For language, we want to refer to this as interaction, because guided practice in a lesson for content is me with you. In an ELD lesson, I want this to be almost always you with you. So this is kid to kid or kid with text. So my guided practice is going to be my, he calls them interaction mini lines, doesn't he? Okay, so we're gonna use ZWIERS' term of interaction mini lines. And this is what I used in my room as tea party. It wasn't quite as formal, but we're gonna use those interaction mini lines. And I'm just gonna draw a quick chart. If I've got 8 kids, I know that I'm gonna have 8 kids face to face. And I just wanna remind myself of what that strategy looks like. That's gonna be my guided, my interaction. And I'm just gonna make this note to myself. I'm just gonna cross out that term, guided practice, and just remind myself, this is my time for student interaction. Okay. And what are the kids gonna do? The kids are going to answer questions from the text with prepositions. And then on my side, I'm just gonna put, on the left side, I'm gonna put where and when. And then again, I need to go back into the text and just figure out what that's gonna sound like. I also wanna think about how much time is it going to take them in these lines? Is 30 seconds gonna be too long with third graders? Probably. So I'm gonna say I'm gonna give them about 15 seconds for interaction. So line A, we'll talk for 15 seconds. Line B, we'll talk for 15 seconds, and then we'll move them, okay? And then my independent practice for language is actually gonna be my assessment or my closure. So I'm just gonna change that term. We talked about that earlier, the importance of a quick assessment. And for that, I'm gonna lead the kids in answering a when and a where question. And I'm gonna listen for that preposition. And I'm gonna ask them to do that on the whiteboard as a final assessment. So it's the same assessment I did at the beginning, but this time I'm making sure that they understood it. If they didn't get it, or I see that a couple of them didn't, I just mark that down so that I know for next time that I need to revisit that or give them further instruction. I also want to think about if we get halfway through this and it's super easy for them, I may give them the next level. I may go to bridging and move them to original. So like you can see, generate sentences with sentence frames if necessary. If I see they can do it without a frame, I'll have them do it without a frame. If I feel like they need the frame, I always start with the frame and then move away from it. But if I see they're getting it, then I remove the scaffold of the frame. If I see that they're not getting it, I add that scaffold in. Does that make sense? So a lot of times when I walk in, especially when it's this kind of situation where I'm walking in where I don't know the kids, I'll start with a frame and realize they don't need it and remove it. I've also had times where I think they won't need it and they do need it. So I've always got that other ready. One up, one down. So I've got a frame if they need it. I'm ready to remove that frame if they don't. And that's my quick assessment then will be, can they do that on the whiteboard? I see in their lesson, they say, have partners compose new sentence about fox. Instruct them to use the prepositions in, to, over, and through. I think that's a nice closure. That think, pair, right, share. You know, I always say think right, pair, right, share. So I'm going to use their practice as my assessment. I just want to make a note to myself. So I'm just going to say practice at bottom of page. Because I don't want to rewrite that on my lesson plan if it's already written in my lesson plans. I don't want to take that much time, okay? So you can see I maybe have 50 words that I've written here. It really doesn't matter as much what I wrote as the thinking that I just did, that I was thinking through. Okay, if they need a frame, what will that frame look like? Did they provide that frame? What will I do if they know how to do it? How will they show me that, that they know? And most important, what's my interaction gonna be? How am I going to have kids work with other kids to generate language? Not teacher to child, but child to child. And that's the most important part of your lesson, is that opportunity for interaction. And I want to think in my head as I'm providing designated ELD, my kids should be talking at least half the time. So half of that lesson should be child to child interaction and practice of whatever skill I've taught. So kind of want you to use that as my measure of whether I've completed a designated ELD lesson, because it should be about 50% interaction. Okay.